Hello friends, this is the fourth week where we will go over some of the stuff that we have in our extension libraries. And then hopefully after this we talk about tar. Alright, Miriam, take it away.
Sounds good. So as part of the feature to add metrics to memory cache, we also wanted to add we just wanted to add a flag, opt-in flag for memory cache options. Towards the end, the last comment, I believe, should contain that API proposal, just so that whenever that's set, we would start tracking for statistics. Otherwise, we would make sure the hot path, like try get value, doesn't get altered by, like its performance doesn't get altered the way it already is. That's the gist of it, just an additional flag here. And if you have any questions, let me know. What we did is that we kind of went through the pull requests and checked the benchmarks for tech and power, and then realized in order for us to like increment the hit or miss, as we call try get value, there is like a so there's like about 5% drop in requests per second if we were to always have it opt-in. And then it seems like not all users necessarily would want to get cache statistics, so why would we want to alter the benchmarks performance? And that's the motivation.
I just wanted to say that I really like this idea, because most likely majority of the users don't need to pay the price for it. But my question is, what will be the behavior of calling the method that provides the statistics when it's disabled? Will we return zeros or throw?
No. So if the flag opt-in flag is false, then get current statistics would return null, and it's already approved as a nullable. And that's one thing. Yeah. And then there's another slight thing. Memory cache options also has this other flag called size limit. And if that is not set, the last item here, which is current estimate size, which is nullable, will be null too, because if size limit is not set, we're not tracking the size.
Should we just throw when somebody calling it without enabling it to give some hint that what is wrong?
I think last time we said we don't want to do that because the idea was that maybe you can't check upfront easily whether you can actually retrieve statistics, and there might be other cases that are depending on other configuration that would basically make that impossible.
So if somebody calling it and getting null and doesn't have any clue about what's going on, what we expect them to do at that time?
Stack Overflow.
For the most part, I think the idea was that we would document the API as if you can't retrieve statistics that we would return null. But I mean, for the most part, I think the calling code wouldn't do anything, right? They would just say, oh, we only track data when there is data, and if there's no data, then we don't track anything. I think the question is more for the user, how do you troubleshoot it yourself? I'm not sure that, you know, giving you an API that allows you to check upfront is going to be super helpful, right? Because if this thing returns false, well, then you're not necessarily, you know, any smarter about it, right? So I would generally assume if you hook up something like application insights or something that, you know, we would output something in the beginning of the session that says, hey, because of X, Y, Z, memory cache statistics are disabled, right? And then you would have to poke around there to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I think prior to this change, the only reason this API would return null is if it wasn't a memory cache, right? And it was the default interface implementation. And yeah, I think the idea is like a framework might be resolving my memory cache and, you know, trying to provide extra information if it's available, but if it's not, we don't want to break the app. And the only difference here is like perhaps someone in this case, you know, really wants it to work, and an exception can make it easier to figure out like, oh, I need to flip this rule. But I'm personally leaning towards continuing to return null and documenting it on the memory cache with dot comments.
What if we flip the default around and said by default, we're going to be tracking. If this is critical to the performance of your app, you can shut it off. Because like the Tech and Power benchmark is a little bit, it's really like the worst case scenario in my opinion of this. Like it is calling try get value on the cache super often, right?
If I remember correctly, we already have some other settings that are affecting the performance and they are disabled by default. If I remember correctly, it's tracking the linked entries, which was a breaking change introduced a while ago. So to tell the long story short, like the default settings are performant.
I mean, it depends on what we want to skin that cat, right? I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily better or worse to turn things off by default. But I think the question is, how do people discover what they have to do to turn things on, or how would they discover that there are things that they could be doing? Like if it literally just boils down to add 4 lines of code to your startup and set this thing to true, then that might be acceptable.
Hey, I'm just wondering, instead of having like config switch or something like this, should we have like opt-in method? I mean, telling like enable stats, and after that everything will work. So people will be intentionally calling this to get the stats.
I mean, that's kind of what's happening, right? Because you basically call what is it, use memory cache or whatever on the in startup, right? And I think there's an overload that takes the options, and there you would basically set this thing to true.
Okay.
And that's somewhat in line with how ASP.NET generally speaking works, right? Where you get an overload that takes a lambda that receives the options. I think so the only benefit for basically making it by default on is to just minimize ceremony. But I think you probably don't benefit from memory statistics unless you have something like App Insights hooked up, anyways, right? You know, out of the box, it doesn't do anything for you, no matter what you do. I mean, unless you want to print memory statistics to the console, very useful.
So Levi, the question you had over like, I mean, I'm assuming if like iMemory cache, iOptions, if someone injects it, then they can check if the memory cache options flag is set or not. But why would you? Yeah, I was wondering you were going to respond there.
So for people on the stream, the question was, how do you get the options back out of the iMemory cache instance? Because there's otherwise no way to query whether the flag is enabled. And if something I just wrote in chat is like, if people need to be able to query whether something's enabled without actually getting the statistics data, then that's a gap in the API surface. If instead the scenario is you should never really query whether it's enabled, you should just try getting the stats and handle the failure gracefully if it returns null. Like if that's the scenario, then great, there's no need to have a property that says whether it's enabled or not on the actual instance itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the question is, if you do a lot of work with those statistics, right, then you may want to do this upfront in order to just turn off this entire path as well, right?
At which point you called and got one statistics object, it's not going to be any measure on your application performance at all.
Yeah.
Like the nullarity of the return value is the presence of the Boolean.
Yeah, and I can't imagine someone's going to be asking over and over and over again, is this enabled, is this enabled?
Because if we wanted to track the thing, then we would add it as a property on memory cache, then we'd say, oh, what about iMemory cache? And then we'd say we can't have default properties. At least I don't think you can have default implementation properties yet. And so then we'd make it be a method, and then people would be like, oh, why does it have to be a method? So I think the best answer is we just don't have it. And all we do is we talk about what the name of the new property on the options type should be. In particular, I think that we should help people understand the default by what line of code they should write to change it by calling it, instead of track statistics, either enable if it's off by default or disable if it's on by default.
I mean, in fairness, you can add properties. I mean, the M stands for members.
Okay,
I
thought that it was like I thought it was one of those things that was limited to one kind of member so far.
So how is this different from any of the other properties on memory cache options? It has size limit, it has track linked cache entries and all of that. So, I mean, the same questions we'd be asking about if the statistics is tracked or not would be the same for like the size limit property, which is already on the memory cache option. Just wondering, but anyways.
It's not. You're right. It's not. It just came down to like, do people care? And it sounds like the answer is no. People wouldn't care about getting this. Just try the operation, and it's an implementation detail as to how it works under the covers.
Sure.
I mean, it's generally, I think, API-wise, not great that the options are far away from the thing that you actually use. But I think that would be the actual opinion. Like, if we think that that people will care about the setting, should find a way to expose the options directly. I don't think it makes sense to. But it sounds like we don't care, so. Right, so then any objections with the proposed API state? Track statistics, we okay with that?
I think it should be enable or disable, whichever one is that you have to write equal true in your code. But so if it's off by default, we should call it enable. If it's on by default, we should call it disable.
The name to be enable or disable?
It's right now if you, so, you know, there's the discussion here of should it be on or off by default, which only slightly matters for this room, except the notion that if somebody's looking at these options and they're like, oh, there's this statistics thing. Do I want it? What's the default, right? And you're going to have a default. You pretty much can't change it because libraries. And so I think the best answer is figure out what the default is, codify it, and the general convention is the line that somebody needs to write for a Boolean is true to change it. So, so instead of track, it should be enable or disable. To me, others can disagree.
My only thing about enable would be because the value of the memory cache options never changes. It's like an options passed to the constructor. So if it's enabled, it could be a bit misleading, as if like it could like it could be enabled at some point later. And that's all I have, unless like it was like include statistics. I don't know, but I don't have it.
I mean, to me, they all sound very similar. Like, I mean, enable statistics or track statistics. I mean, track statistics kind of implies there's work that needs to happen. I think track statistics equals true to me reads.
So if you saw an option track statistics, you would assume that it's off by default?
Well, I mean, it's generally, I mean, maybe. I mean, we have a lot of APIs where the default value is not false. But I mean, so I'm not sure I would necessarily deduce that the default is false. But if the default is false, I would know what it means.
Fair enough.
And one more point for track is there's already one property called track linked cache entries on the same thing. On memory cache options, we have track linked cache entries.
Fair enough. I guess anybody who wants to know can go look at docs and see what we docked the default as.
Yeah. So I was going to ask whether we tend to give properties verb names, but consistency within the options type is more important anyway.
I mean, track, you could treat it as a verb.
It is a verb, yeah.
With Boolean properties, it's welcome to the grammar of elision. Of
I see.
what it's really saying is, should track properties, and then that's just answering a true/false question. Which again, should is a verb, but so is, and that's common in properties.
Cool.
Right then, I guess this is it.
Thank you.
Right. Generic rate limiter. We have people on the call to talk about it?
Yes. So should I just give a brief overview of what we've talked about last time, or we continue?
Yeah, totally.
So last time we showed off the builder pattern, and we decided it was a bit confusing because it wasn't obvious if a chaining was there or if it was like single policies that could be run at a time. We also didn't like the name, which, yeah, it was terrible. So we agreed upon a partitioned rate limiter. And I think it was Tobe who suggested that we have a static create method that you would write an if statement basically on the resource and return the key. And then you could later in another func as part of that create method, you would look at that key and return a specific rate limiter instance. And so I think that's roughly where we ended last time. And so I tried that out to see like what it would look like. And it's kind of bad because you have to duplicate your logic for the if statements in both of the funcs that the create method took. So I proposed a couple different iterations to make that better. And I think I've come up with an iteration that looks nice in that we have that if statement, which is super great for disambiguating the chaining versus non-chaining. And it keeps like the APIs that the builder introduced, like with concurrency limiter, with token bucket, but like without the builder pattern. So if you scroll down, I think to my last comment, it has the new proposed APIs. This is all like just walking through the thought process and stuff. So yeah, right here. We have the create method, which takes the func of resource to the a new type, which is basically a wrapper around a tuple to give us the nice IntelliSense. And you basically now have that if statement and you return a tuple of key to resource. So we can have things like create concurrency limiter, which is a nice wrapper around returning that tuple, or create token bucket limiter or no limiter if you want to have a no policy basically. Yeah, that's essentially what we've come up with.
So to be
Quick
clear,
question.
like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask about the extension methods. Why do they need to be extension methods? Why aren't they just on partition rate limiter?
Oh, at the very bottom?
Yeah.
Um,
And it's not like they're interfaces, right? This is the one value of getting classes. You might as well just put the methods on the class itself.
Sure. I think I added them as extension methods because like they were not part of my main design, and I was just like, oh, we should add these things. I don't know if they need to specifically be extension methods.
Yeah, basically, unless something needs to be an extension method, it shouldn't be.
Okay.
In case Tanner's rolling his eyes at that, complicated things involving generics and Jan Codis explaining why it needs to be an extension method is a reason it needs to be an extension method. I don't think it applies here.
Yeah, the primary reason
I don't
for
think
me
it applies here either.
to remove the noise, right? Because the problem is that all these extension types, like especially in some of the API services in ASP.NET, they are like adding a ton of noise. And if you hunt for functionality, it's actually a pain in the ass if you try to find where stuff actually logically belongs. I would just make them part of the core API.
Should we scroll up to like the usage examples? Okay, we.
Oh yeah, at the very top of this comment, I think I showed the usage, so it's a little bit clearer.
So imagine that you're trying to like rate limit requests, but you don't want to use the same rules for every request.
So the first one is just like if we had to use a tuple instead, and the second one obviously is with a new type rate limit partition that wraps the tuple, so we have nicer methods on it.
And the pattern here is, so for this very top one, if you have all posts are going to use the same concurrency, right?
Yes,
because
yes.
Post then becomes the key, and so a second thing comes in, hits the same key, so it does not evaluate the func a second time.
Correct.
Okay. And so really the really interesting case in the top example is the else, because that's a dynamic key being expressed of this can represent thousands of different concurrency limiters being manifest, as opposed to the others, which are a singleton.
Right. Well, almost a single.
They're if this comes up, it comes up once. Yeah. Singlishton. I can wordsmith. Yeah, I mean, to me, this looks like the what we were hoping for in making the code have flow. So this looks reasonable to me.
We like using value tuples like this.
Well, the proposal had a strong type. I don't know if that means it just put an implicit conversion from value tuple, which is bad.
The top one is me explaining.
Yeah.
And then the second one is actually like, oh, we could actually make this better by having the type.
Oh, so the top one's just
Pseudocode.
like pseudocode?
Right.
But then I guess I'm not seeing it because you're still duplicating, no? Or I guess you're duplicating the keys now. But that...
Oh, sure. But I mean, you had to do that like no matter what.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you could probably extract the constant if you cared, but yeah.
Right.
I mean, generally speaking, I think I'm not opposed to tuples if we know for a fact that a certain thing is kind of, logically constrained to a certain arity, right? So like the zip function and thing comes to mind. You take two inputs, so you always produce, two output logic or one output with two. It makes sense that we use tuples. But yeah, and generally speaking, you can't evolve tuples, so that's why.
I don't think we're seriously proposing the tuple right now. I think that just showed the progression of the API design here.
Yeah, it was just
because there are
answering
issues.
the question from Eric, but yeah,
Yeah.
It seems we just want the factory method here anyway. I actually like how it reads because I think it makes it very clear what's happening.
Yep, that was one of the good things from our last review.
Yeah, I mean, it does take the one-time establishment of the lambda only fires once per key, but you know that's fine. It's like reading a line that says lazy. So.
I mean, it has still the same problem, right? I mean, the fundamental problem is you basically create this one place where everything needs to sync in, basically, right? Because you now have these factory methods on the rate limit partition that you keep evolving. But I think that's fine, right? If somebody has their own rate limiter, right, they wouldn't get the extension or the factory method. They would have to construct it themselves. But that seems fine.
I'd use the top one, create, I think, right?
So to be clear though, like this lambda is called once per rate limit request, right? Because you need to determine the key.
Well, the first one, yeah.
Of each request. Well, even the follow-up request to determine what the key actually is.
Well, the big lambda that is the block of code is called every time. The little lambdas that are in return, rate limit, partition, create, those are only called when the key was
matched.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. You have to be.
Or when the key didn't match.
Mm-hmm.
So when the dictionary did not already contain this key.
Yep.
And that's the thing that I'm like, oh, you have to kind of look at this and be like, oh, it's not creating a new one every time we get a post. It's creating a new one the first time we get a post and then sharing it. And it's just like, yep, you got to get. Once you let that sink in, then it's fine.
Well, I have questions actually based on what was just said. So there's a dictionary sticking around somewhere. Like, who actually owns that dictionary? Is that within the implementation of this method? Or is it like does the application or caller own that? Like, eventually a partition key needs to be mapped to a resource limiter, right?
Yeah.
Who does that mapping?
It's the type that's returned by this method. So it's our internal type that manages it.
Yeah, so doesn't that mean that the key needs to be like I-equatable or something along those lines? So that you can see that if two keys are actually should be going to the same limiter?
So dictionary doesn't have a constraint on the key, it looks like, as long as it's not null.
Right, it calls dot equals or something.
It does a bunch of, I think, things like checks.
Yeah. It looks for I-equatable a T, and then failing that, it just calls dot equal and just boxes everywhere.
Yeah. So
you would do the same thing then.
Right. In the proposed API, I just have the not null. That's it, because that's all dictionary required.
Do you ever flush your entries?
Yes. I didn't mention it, but in the previous review, we did talk about a new API to the base rate limiter type that lets us see how long the rate limiter has been idle, and then we can flush old entries based on that.
As in, you would actually remove those keys from the dictionary, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, the reason I'm asking is you could imagine that, if you're using the URL as a key, like, oh, and that's being held in some static somewhere in the application, I'm just going to start flooding your application with requests for bogus URLs. And now I'm just going to cause an at some point because I know that you're holding onto that data indefinitely.
Yep.
It wasn't but the dictionary fundamentally is static, right? Because it's not tied to the instance of this particular lambda. Right?
It's tied to the instance of the partitioned rate limiter.
Yes.
Which presumably is a singleton.
For your app, your app scope, it's probably a singleton. Like, I don't think anyone would write the else the way that he wrote the else. I assume that's demonstration, right?
That is demonstration.
You would have, if it's a post, use this one. If it's cookie, use that one. If I'm an admin, be unlimited. Otherwise, probably be a one shared rate limiter, or be a, static gets this rate limiter and non-static gets this other rate limiter.
But I still don't understand.
Like maybe per user, but yeah, like we probably wouldn't want to put this in our docs.
But all these create methods, like the key goes somewhere, right? The key can't be tied to the rate limit partition because that's the thing you're producing.
It's the partitioned rate limiter so like the top line of the code is partitioned rate limiter of context limiter is a partitioned rate limiter dot create of this. That has the dictionary inside it.
But how does that chaining work? Because you call a static method, you don't call the instance method on this. You're not calling resource dot create, you're calling a static function on rate limit partition create. So that dictionary has to be effectively static. I don't know where else to get it from.
No, it's inside the instance of the rate limiter.
That's created by create.
Because this is the lambda. So partition rate limiter gets a request. It runs it through this lambda, which gives back a, this is the key I want you to use. And if you don't already know about this key, this is the func I want you to call.
Okay, maybe I'm not getting it, but inside these, like, let's say, let's take the first method here, right? Inside this create method, how do you get access to that? Because that's a static function in the rate limit partition type. So how do you access the dictionary that comes that belongs to this guy? Yeah.
You don't. You've said for this request, post is the key. And if you've not seen the word post before, then go create the concurrency rate limiter on the, with the ... If you have seen it, then use the one that you already know about.
Do we need to look at this methods on partition rate limiter again? Like they basically all take this T resource. So yeah, the dictionary is all internal to the partition rate limiter type that we create.
This is a key selector and value producer tuple. You don't get to see the dictionary. You just get asked what should the key have been for this, and if appropriate, what's the value, or if we need to create a new value, how do we create it?
Yeah, basically what you're saying is that what this guy creates here, the instance that it returns back knows which key it was created for, and then that key itself is used by this guy here to stash it in some dictionary.
The instance, yeah, not the
static. So these methods here don't modify any dictionaries; they just give you back an instance that is somehow tied to the key you're passing. Yeah, makes sense.
So a few things. If you are doing dictionary manipulation under the covers, you should consider an overload that takes an I equality comparer, because that way somebody can control how the dictionary is created. Also, keep in mind if you're, it looks like what you're doing here is you're trying to put this in front of incoming requests before it hits the application. In .NET, the only dictionary that is guaranteed to be resilient against hash flood DOSes is dictionary of string, anything. Dictionary of object, anything is not resilient. Dictionary of int, anything is not resilient. It's very specifically dictionary of string, blah. So if you expect people to pull out things like random integers from URLs, you could actually open your application to a DOS vulnerability. Maybe that's a documentation thing, just something to keep in mind.
So can you explain?
I could see people.
Because I mean, like a string is still a huge value space, right?
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, there's special zip compare.
Oh yeah, we have special protections only when T key is string. That is the only time that those protections are guaranteed to be in place. If T key is object and you just happen to be passing in strings, protections are not guaranteed to be in place.
So there's like a cryptographically secure hash function for string that dictionary uses, or something along those lines to make sure it's hard to force hash collisions.
Yes,
but I do see people potentially like using enums and stuff for like when there is that common like fixed set of like rate
that
limiters.
would be insecure in this world.
I mean, if you're using an enum and you only have 4 things,
if you only have 4 things and the user can't give you random integers to go in there, then you're fine. Because at that point you're limiting the space that can go in there. If you have like the entire 4 billion value space of int32, like that's a problem obviously. But I'm just saying you have if someone uses a extract like a user ID from the incoming URL and then return that as an integer via int.parse, like if we need to make sure that we're not documenting that that's a sample that people should follow.
So we should basically document like you should have a limited known like size of your keys or something along those lines.
you should have a finite space that these can map into, where that space is very, very constrained, or use string because it's going to be protected everywhere.
Yeah, so really I would guess the canonical sample, to take what's on the screen right now, would be the else would be return
default or something.
Must represent the default key, or I guess you just say the word default or something, and it'd be like, this is the shared, everything else uses this one rate limiter. So you've broken out these are the 3 cases that will ever be in my dictionary.
Yeah. I think all of that's a doc issue. It's just we should be very careful with the docs here that we're not, you know, leading people down a path of sadness.
And
But
samples, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a tractable problem. We've done that before.
Should we have a rate limit partition dot, I don't know, create default partition that uses null and just stores this in a field next to the dictionary instead of using the dictionary? I'm just, instead of telling somebody make up a key for the word default, because otherwise if it could accidentally collide with some of their other logic, then it seems.
Oh, I see. I mean, we could have a rate default overload. Would that work?
I don't know about that.
I'm just like,
Like-
it's just a if, or that you say that null can be returned as a special thing. And maybe it doesn't matter.
I mean,
I think we should be very clear in the docs that for most cases you want to have a very finite set of keys.
I mean, I think the way you
and
would,
not use these kind of examples where we have like request URI to string.
I mean, what you could do is you could just have a diction, like a global set of URLs you care about, and then, you know, after you call resource request to string, you see whether that string is in your set, and if it is, use it as a key. Otherwise, you drop it on the floor. And then this way you can use URLs, but you would limit it to the 12 URLs you care about rather than the attacker-controlled input space.
Right.
so the problem
Sure, I
with
think-
null is that you need to make your T resource nullable. Otherwise, you get compiler warnings.
Right.
Fair enough. Okay, which makes create default hard. So yeah, all right. It's the user problem to come up with whatever the default key is.
Yep, in good docs.
Right. I mean, it seems to me like there might be an actual analyzer here, because it seems fairly common for people to do what you have done in the code here, and that would be immediately problematic. Don't pass in open-ended inputs.
Could you write an analyzer for that? Seems a bit hard.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
the trivial thing you can check for is the argument literally this what you wrote, right? Resource request URI to string, and that seems.
I mean, you could certainly do something that says, hey, you didn't have a literal, but now you need to decide which of the paths is the open-ended path. Because if you started with, if it's not post, then be something otherwise, or then do something dynamic looking. And then the final line is return post is the key, and an analyzer that's like, look for the last return statement or whatever's in the else. You've now tricked it because it sees a literal.
Well, you don't have to do that, right? I would literally just say you look at the input arguments that are provided to the create methods, and you see whether any of them is literally like, you know, known inputs that people will likely use, like resource request URI to string, for example. Say, well, don't do that. And so even if that's not perfect, I think it gives you a way to effectively make the docs a bit more sticky, right? Because people, you know, only tend to read the docs once they were bitten by this. But I think the problem is that people don't do that up front. And so like it's a way for you to advertise, hey, think about your input space as a closed set and make sure that you pass in, you know, things that you know are part of a closed set, right? And that might be good enough, right? That might inform a lot of people.
That's fair. I'm having trouble imagining how one could write such a thing, because again,
Being
taking
very hard coded.
your
Yeah, it would be like that. It would be
your last thing of you have a utility method of you pass in resource.request URI and it asks, is this one of the 14 things I care about? If so, return the key based off that. Otherwise, return the word default. Like you've moved the logic out and it sees, oh God, you have an input that's based on request URI.
No, that's why I wouldn't. So it depends on how you want to write the analyzer, right? I would write the analyzers in a way where I wouldn't try to effectively check against an allow list, and rather I would check for things that are put in a deny list and say, hey, I know that request URI to string as direct input for the create methods is a bad pattern, so you check for that, right? Because
Fair.
I think
So you would only fail if the input was literally
stuff like this. Yeah.
x.request URI or x.request URI.toString.
Yes, I would just have basically you know, things that we very likely expect people to grab from the request that we know are problematic, and then just inform them of that, right? Because my impression is, as people write the code, right, the very first time they write the application, they try the most naive thing possible. Right, they're not then they're not starting with, oh, I have helper methods that put stuff in some buckets or something, right? And then as they're doing that, they see squiggles show up in the ID, and they're like, oh, okay, that's a good point, and then they start thinking about it. That's my impression. It's not perfect, but it might get you, halfway there for people to basically be aware that this is a thing that you should, and that's good enough.
Okay, can we see the definition of rate limit partition? Like, I don't understand why create token bucket limiter is special. Oh, because you create it with options.
Yeah, so I mean, the main one, of course, is that you take a func that returns a rate limiter. And then the rest are all helpers, or not helpers, what do you call it? Just nice syntactic sugar. And then the other interesting one is the no limiter, because otherwise you have to like create your own type that doesn't do any limiting basically, and use the first create method for that. So it's just nice to add a simple way for you to do that. One question that an external contributor raised is whether we want async support, and if we want to pass the resource into the factory, because right now we're just passing the key through.
Well, another option, right, is to take the options directly for the ones that take the options, but I guess it would require like potentially greedily allocating, because you don't know if the options are going to need to be used, right? So if the options are key dependent, like you could just new it up because you have the key from the outer func. But like it would,
that is greedy allocation.
If it is key dependent, yeah, then you're allocating the options every single rate limiting attempt. So I could see why maybe not.
I mean, if it came up, you could add a create. I mean, you'd need to figure out how to track it, obviously, but you could add the create overload that takes what's the key, what's object user state, or sorry, what's to state or object user state, and then pass that in as a second func of, then you just be asking, because you've used the type instead of value tuple, you can't extend it for, oh, we're doing, this is supposed to be called async, this one's supposed to be called with the user state, etc. So.
Again, like in my thought is like there's certain things like maybe users where like the key will be somewhat dynamic, but I think in a lot of these cases, like these, if else branches are going to be fairly static once you're in them. So it might be convenient to just like take the options directly. Like for example, like if you're an admin, like and you're in that if admin branch, like right? Like there's only one value it could possibly be. So you don't really need the T key at that point.
I mean, you can store the options outside of this class and just use the same instance in that case.
That's what I'm saying. And that's what might make it convenient not to have to supply a factory. But yeah.
Why are all admins sharing the same rate limiter? Obviously, if is admin, then use a special admin plus your username.
That's a fair point. And at that point, you want T resource and not T key. I think that's very valid.
No, I mean, like, again, I think especially since it's not using value tuple directly, it's things can be added as scenarios pop up. This creates the door for creating more complex overloads, and all the complication would be inside the hey, I got a thing, the key didn't hit, what do I do now? Well, now which of the create methods did you call? Because that'll tell you on a hidden field or something which way you're supposed to call the bound delegate. So I am surprised that the rate limit partition is a class. This is one of the places that I think I would have written it as a struct.
I guess there's no reason for it to be a class. Well, it's static. It's not. Do you do static structs anywhere? Seems unusual.
Wait. No. I mean.
Oh, sorry.
not-
Rate limit partition is the generic assist for rate limit partition of T, and rate limit partition of T. I'm surprised is a class instead of a struct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So why, like with this, is it just like a performance thing? You think that these will be created enough that it'll be and short-lived enough?
I mean,
that we'll
this
probably
is
wanna see this
literally like if you're wiring it up for something like Azure management framework or the Azure management plane, right? This is literally every request comes in. Literally every request says, here's the tuple of my key and my func, and then immediately throws that away. This does feel like take the 2 register return with a struct and save on the GC noise.
Yeah, presumably like 99% of the time we get one of these, we look at the key, it's already in the dictionary, we throw it away.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and I mean, even if it's not, we still throw it away because we just want the 2 properties that we're setting on it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would ever really want to save one of these. You're not going to pass it through multiple layers, and even if we go the route of you have fine, did you create me with a func of just the key or a func with a key and a state or etc., then you can collapse all the delegates into delegate and know from a mode field which one to cast it back into to pull it back out, and like you're never going to really exceed 24 or 32 bytes, so struct seems better here. Yeah, I don't think I'm sick. Okay.
So what will be a struct? The rate limiter or which one?
Rate limit partition of T.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
Because
Can you
as
seal structs, probably
can use what?
sealed structs.
Well,
Is
they're
that a thing?
always sealed.
Okay,
There's no such thing as heritable structs.
gotcha.
Yeah. Aside from the magic type value type, but that's an implementation detail of the runtime.
I mean, in fact, I mean, it could be a record, right?
Records just
A fancy struct, but like it's basically
fancy syntax to create the struct. I would just declare it as struct. And
Records can be classes, and as of the latest, C# can also be structs because they were only classes originally, and they just provide some implicit syntax sugar for providing things like IEquatable and toString and other functionality. It's not really its own type. It's just a nice way to give yourself default implementations of things.
Yeah, to me, the interesting conversation here is like, should it implement it? Because if it does, then effectively, then you get very close to the semantics of.
I don't think so. I mean, we'll be comparing the keys. In theory, the factory should probably be the same reference all the time for the same key if you're doing anything performant. But yeah, I don't particularly think the partitions need to be equatable themselves.
yeah, I mean, once it's a struct, the guidelines say it should be, but this is not really a thing that's being like people should never see this, so I don't care.
And presumably, we do care about the allocation, right?
That's why I suggested turning it from a class into a struct.
Right.
But this isn't
Every
really a
request.
user interactable struct. It's their entire relationship with it is they wrote return create, and they should never be looking at it. It's really an internal piece of data from partition rate limiter.
I mean, is it fair to say that it's logically just a way to return multiple values from the create method? So it's basically a short-lived type. Immediately gets deconstructed on the receiving end, and immediately they're stashed away anyway.
Yeah, it's value tuple, except with the right to increase the arity over time with things like adding support for async funcs and user state to avoid
TQ
capturing
versus
the lambda.
T-resource.
Yep.
Yeah.
That works.
So
I mean, then the
So I
only thing
guess
I would
here
say, I
TQ
would do is I would probably have properties to retrieve the things you put in, but other than that, it's
I
a
mean,
bit odd that you can't.
it could, but again, the expected The expected thing is really it's the fancy syntax for return on this key selector.
Yeah, mostly like wondering about the debugging experience, right? When you actually debug your fancy create method, and you may have local variables of the return tape, for example. You want to just see what you put in there.
That's fair. I mean, we can declare them as get only properties that
that's what I would.
Pull their thing out of the constructor.
If we had get only properties, that means in the future, if we had like async and whatnot, we'd have to have more get only properties, right?
Yeah, I mean, you would basically you would retrieve the state that you put. Because logically, I mean, the thing has to store it as fields, right? So like the data is there. So
yeah, but even if you in the struct collapsed, func of t key and rate limiter, as well as func of t key object rate limiter into the same delegate, the properties would just return the delegate cast as the type that it says that it's supposed to be. So you'd end up with 4 properties that are all doing as, and people only see them in the debugger. Who cares?
Yep.
Though it would be a weird problem because once we do expose it as properties, now we have to come up with names for factory and user state factory and async factory and async user state factory, and in this case
become nullable too.
In this case, again, because it's really just a way of returning a 2-part thing, if we are only adding the properties for debugging, turns out the debugger shows fields. So personally, still not sick. I think that that in this case the minimum shape like this is probably better.
So you would not expose them as.
I mean, the key can be exposed as a property, but the delegate, going back to we can extend it later to support multiple types of delegates because it's just under the covers detail, means that now we have to come up with names, and that I wouldn't. So the key, sure, we can make that one be a get only property, but I wouldn't expose the factory back.
And what about the resource? Because we were talking about passing the resource through. Would we also want to store that as a property? Or the state, I guess, not necessarily the resource.
Right, and so that, the only thing on any expansion of this that exists in my head that I would put as a property would be the partition key.
Yeah, I actually think key is enough because in theory, like if the specific resource was important, then it shouldn't be the same key because you're going to get it back again, like the next time another resource gives you that key.
Indeed. Because the caller or the partitioned rate limiter doesn't understand this is a key that came from the 3rd waterfall. It just sees that it says Stefan, and unfortunately that collides with the 2nd waterfall, which said Stephen. But since they're spelled the same, they use the same rate limiter. So be careful with your keys. Which I guess goes back to Levi's. Maybe somewhere in here we should have the IA quality comparer or whatever it is the dictionary accepts for.
Another thing that Levi brought.
I want to do something different.
Sorry.
Which
I think is interesting is like a mitigation. Is I almost wonder if we should ask the creator of this partition rate limiter to specify some sort of max size on the dictionary just to prove that it's bounded, or something along those lines.
Well, one interesting behavior there is like what happens the next time a request comes in and you go above the maximum dictionary size. Do you just fail the request?
Yeah, that is the question. Like because it wouldn't be valid to call, like especially if there's state in any of those rate limiters and they weren't idle.
Yeah, because
And I
you
think
definitely you don't want to lock out like an admin rate limiter, for instance.
Yeah, that's fair.
The partitioned rate limiter exposing as a property the partition count, which would just be, dictionary.count, seems reasonable and like a thing that somebody could log if they cared, to see if they're having runaway behavior. Whether you're using dictionary or concurrent dictionary, it doesn't matter. They both have a count property. And it's a dirty read, so whatever. But I think I would do that over asking what the policy question should be if somebody gave in a hard limit.
So for the iEquality compare, would that be a second, or would that second create method, or would that be built into the main one and just nullable?
I mean, it could be a default parameter on the creates on all four of them, I guess.
So this is an interesting thing, Jeremy. Is like I was just reading the .NET API guidelines, and it looked like it still said that like overloads were preferred for numbers over default values, but like
it depends on how many you have.
A lot. Okay.
If you're looking at what we have on MSDN, that's out of date.
Okay.
The lawyers don't make things easy. If you are looking at what we have in the book, it's 1 or 2 defaults is fine, but really at 2 you need to start asking, should you make an overload that doesn't have any? And if you have 3 defaulted parameters, you should have an overload that doesn't have any defaults, just because it makes the IntelliSense experience much nicer. It is unfortunate that the only way you can get the compiler to forward that for you is you have to now double specify one of those default values, so it will call the longer version of itself. But that's we put all the work on the library authors because it makes all the application authors' lives easier. So yeah, so default parameters are I think in fact now we prefer them to overloads. Aside from when you have too many, we want the simpler overload.
Sorry.
So you said on all 4, but I was thinking you put the iEquality compare on the rate limiter, the partition rate limiter.
Right. Yeah, because it's not on the partition key. It's on the yeah. Okay. So yes, up on partition rate limiter dot create, throwing a default of whatever dictionary wants, iEquality comparer.
That's what dictionary takes.
I assume concurrent dictionary takes the same thing. I guess I assume you're actually using concurrent dictionary here, because this seems like a thing that you would need to use a lot, or you're putting in a lock. But this seems like a thing that's expected to be called from multiple threads.
Yeah, so right now I'm just like
that's your implementation problem. But
thing I'm locking, but we'll see.
Yeah. So what are these extension methods that we don't want to be extension methods?
Right. So this is for 2 other scenarios that can make use of the partition rate limiter. One is for chaining. So that's like if you have some global limiter for your app or whatever, let's say you would like want 100 requests per second globally. But then for each like specific endpoints or something, you might want a different type of rate limiter, like partition rate limiter. Then you need to somehow combine those 2 rate limiters. So you could either A, run them separately yourself, or B, you could create a chained rate limiter that will run both of them for you in a single like API call. And then the second one is basically, imagine you have like a third-party library that provides a partition rate limiter, but it takes keys only, and they're like, policy 1, policy 2 named type of keys, but you're taking an HB context and you want to use those policies from the third-party library, but you need to somehow map the HB context to those policy names. So you would use the adapt partition rate limiter to generate a partition rate limiter that takes those HB contexts, maps them to those keys, and uses the underlying rate limiter that took a string resource. So I think I have examples for both of them, or at least one of them. Yeah, the adapt one, if you scrolled up slightly, or wait, where are you in the? Yeah, if you scroll up slightly, it would show the, yeah, that right there. So, oh, tiny bit more to show the string one. Yeah. So you basically have, policy 1, policy 2, and it takes a string as a resource. But your thing is an HB context. So you would call adapt partition, and you'd map the HB context to that string. But you'd get back a limiter that uses HB context. So your API could still have the HB context resource.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, the latter thing came from I think discussion with Azure Resource Manager throttling stuff. They're like, oh well, we have policies that are just strings. I don't know how you want to map that to HB context or whatever, but yeah.
So one question I have is the methods that you have, adapt partition rate limiter and chain rate limiter. They are effectively the same static method, extension methods and the static methods. We could just make them extension methods in the place where they currently live, right?
Oh, did I have both?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell,
yeah.
there's a partition rate limiter where you have static methods, and then you have the extensions that seem like they're the same as except as
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why I have both, but yeah, we can definitely get rid of one.
I mean,
Yeah,
it seems to me, I kind of like the ability to call it either way, because you can think of it as a factory or you can think of it as chaining, and I think that both make sense in this case.
Well, so the adapt one, I think that one should just be an instance method.
Right. I guess that's also
the chain one. I assume the behavior of the chain one is the order that they're passed in is the order that they chain. So there's no from this first one, you're somehow supposed to interpret it as an 8-way fan out into the next tier, and so that one does seem maybe better as a static all by itself.
And that one, should it take a param of rate limiter, or just one at a time? So if you want to do multiple chaining, you'd have to call it multiple times.
I would take a params and then overload that as IEnumerable.
Okay.
Params is, I mean, really, so it's to figure out what the calling patterns are, right? If you want to call it with 2, is there a reason that we should create the intermediate params array, and you can't save that array because what if it was passed in, even though it generally never isn't? So
yeah.
It's figuring out what overloads make sense for your scenarios. If you think that the average that 1 to 3 is, well, I guess 1 is easy. If 2 and 3 are going to be in 99% of the use case, then maybe it's 2, 3, and the params array, or 2, 3, and enumerable in the params array. And then that just cuts down on creating. But again, you're probably only going to call this once, so it doesn't really matter. Things with string.join is that gets string.concat. That gets called a lot in a real application. So having the 5 parameter string.concat removes a lot of temporary arrays. So if this is probably called once at app startup, maybe the params is the best approach.
That makes sense.
So basically, so we get rid of the type partition rate limiter extensions entirely, right?
Yeah.
And then you said the first method should be regular instance method.
Yeah, I think that I would call that, I don't know, adapt key or something? Like
I mean, to be honest,
translate key.
Yeah, I was about to say, to me, adapt is a weird thing because I mean, you're kind of wrapping the other thing, but as you said, it's really about the key, right?
Yeah. So translate key, which returns a T new key or whatever.
Yeah, I think I kind of like translate key. Ben, what do you think?
You do partition rate limiter dot create and then dot translate key. Sounds fine. Map key.
Map key would also work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't really use map much in the GitHub, which is sad because it's such a short.
Map kind of feels strange in this case because like you just map some keys, like your resource keys and stuff, and then you're calling map key again. It's like, I don't know, it just feels odd to me. Translate is like you're explicitly doing something new with your keys.
So link and call it select key.
Yeah, I that's the one thing in Link I never liked, that we used select, because it seems such an odd choice. But yeah, let's go with translate for now. And then the last one would be also presumably an instance method, or would it still be a static?
I think that one's static because it's creating one partitioned rate limiter from a bunch of partition rate limiters. So I think it would just be the one static params.
Yeah, I mean, unless you want to basically simplify it to say chain with exactly one other thing, if that's the common case, then maybe that's okay. I mean, looking at concat, for example, it always seems weird to concat multiple. Look at the code, it always reads like a complete mess.
Well, I mean, for concat, usually it's, if it's string concat, it's usually that you had like 3 pluses in a row and they looked fine. And that just gets rewritten by the compiler to concat 4.
Yeah, I think the string concat, I think because it's static reads fine, but link's instance concat reads very weird because of the way you write. You end up writing the query. Actually, it would have looked way more sane as a because it's not really. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
So then, okay, we give it a static and we call it what? Create chained. Create. Like, it seems weird to have the suffix rate limiter because everything here is about rate limiter. I think create chained is probably the.
You'd write partition rate limiter dot create chained.
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense. And then just one overload that takes params, or you're saying basically figure out what you need.
I mean, we could. I think the simple or the other overloads can be added as usage suggests, but I mean, Brennan, correct me if I'm wrong. You would expect this to be called at most 3 times in a application.
Right. Yeah.
So
it wouldn't be
who
very
cares
much.
about the intermediate array?
And it's all at startup mainly. Like I wouldn't see this being anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, then I think this is it.
So there were 2 APIs we discussed last time that weren't officially approved. So I just want to make sure that we look at those.
Yeah, before we go there, like, I mean, let's just finish the one that you have here first. So the.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Are we then okay with those notes? Zoom out a tiny bit. Did I miss
They
something?
do technically fit on one page.
If you zoom out far enough, everything fits on one page.
Yeah. I think on the very first method here, I think we were adding a equality comparer of T resource, whatever dictionary calls it, equal null.
So on which one?
The very first method, the partition rate limiter .create.
So there's an overload that takes an equality comparer.
Yeah.
Or we can overload it or we can default it.
Oh, right. I thought we were defaulting it.
That also works. We would default it to null, presumably.
Yeah.
Are we happy with T key for the create methods and T partition key in the main? Like that seems a bit odd, doesn't it? Should we just normalize on T partition key?
Why
I
not
mean-
T key?
Well, yeah, either way.
In the partitioned rate limiter, T resource and T partition key makes sense. Actually, the interesting question is for rate limit partition, why does the T need a name? Why not just T?
True.
I'm sure we have guidance on that. I don't know what it
Yeah,
is, but
if
I'm
we
sure
follow
have
like the func pattern, it has T, T1, and then T result. So the only one that's actually named is T result.
Yeah.
For the create methods on rate limit partition, are we fine? I'm just saying that the two incoming rate limiters, fixed token and sliding, or fixed window and sliding window, are also fine to add create methods for.
Yeah, I
So
would
they're
say-
new rate limiters. Yeah.
I mean, I would generally expect that if you ship new rate limiters in the future, you have a corresponding create methods on rate limit
Okay.
partition. That would be my expectation.
if they need fancy options.
Yeah, they do have their own custom options, I believe.
Well, but something like the token bucket limiter, if the only thing that you would be specifying is the number of tokens in the bucket and the refresh, then that would just, assuming that those are just constructor parameters, then that's probably just create with your constructor parameter specified. If they take a complicated options type, then maybe, yeah, you want to do the like, fine, give me the options type and we'll wire the rest up for you. So it just depends on whether or not it feels obvious that you would just call the first one, or if you want the fancy helpers. But I think that it's fine to grow them.
I mean, if we ship like 10 or 12 different rate limiters, I'd rather have them all have create methods on rate limit partition, so that when you actually create one, the pattern looks sound, so that you always have, rate limit partition or create something, rather than, oh yeah, sometimes I call the constructor, sometimes I call the static factory. That seems odd. If we have hundreds of those, then yeah, it makes sense to say, hey, let's opinionated on which ones we expect. But given that it's like, a dozen or less. I'd rather have the content.
Okay. I think for the most part this looks good. There was the replenishing rate limiter stuff we talked about last time, which token bucket would implement. Like, would we want some kind of create method that took that specifically, or is that just you use the normal create and we don't care? I guess since it doesn't have specific options, we don't care. Yeah, okay. Answer my own question.
Glad we could help.
Hey, rubber ducking is great.
All right, then let me hit comment. And then
Oh,
But were the other things in
Yeah.
the same issue?
yes, that we talked about. So there was the idle since.
so is this the same issue, or is this some other?
Yeah. We talked about it last time in this issue, because there were additions needed for the partition rate limiter. So yeah, you right here, idle since, or idle duration is actually the preferred one that we wanted with the time span question mark. That would be a property on rate limiter, a new property on rate limiter. And then in my comment after yours, I believe I fleshed out the replenishing rate limiter that we also talked about last time. Yeah, right here. And this basically took the common options that we think replenishers would need and the one method that we think they would need, and put them in their own class. And then token bucket would now implement this and get rid of its own try replenish method.
Oh, right. And this is the if you want to wire like 6 of them up to the same timer, you would create them as non-auto and
Right. Yes. Yes.
make your
Just so we
central
can
timer
optimize our
pump
timer.
them all.
Yeah.
So which one would extend this? Partition rate?
The token bucket. Yeah. Because it already has these options on it. So we're just making a common thing so that custom implementations, we can now know if they have a timer built in or not, and if we need to manage the timer for them.
It seems reasonable to me.
I just want to make sure like the naming is nice. It is auto replenishing. I don't know if that's the preferred naming.
I mean, you could remove the is if you wanted, but
Yeah, I mean the options I guess for a token bucket were auto replenishing or auto replenishment or something. It didn't have the is. But it was kind of like we're querying, so I don't know. Instead of setting.
Yeah, it seems fine to me. So Jeremy, you said remove the is.
that we could. And let's see here. You can also prefix Boolean properties with is, can, or has, but only where it adds value.
Yeah, I think is auto replenishing slightly nice.
It reads nicer because you're querying it. So
Yeah, that's fine. I think it's a reasonable name. Either way.
And then I think, oh, you didn't copy the idle duration one?
I didn't see the.
Yeah, the only time I see that is in the
Oh, I
question
thought we
for
were
the
going
review.
with that proposal because it was like,
Oh yeah, I mean I can just type up what I had.
yeah, you had it typed up already. Just Control F idle duration, I think.
Would be on which type is it again?
The main rate limiter base class, abstract base class. Yeah.
And it would be
Getter. Oh,
is it virtual or how does it work?
I made it abstract because we want people to explicitly have to implement this, like the implementations.
And you haven't shipped stable yet, right?
Right.
Right. Well.
Oh, time span should be nullable.
Right.
In the idle duration. Yeah. Because some rate limiters may never want to be idle.
Question marks are so funny. It always reads like you're second guessing your own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I mean, it's just a nit, but we did say that T key should be T for some of these types, right? Like I can.
Yeah, I looked up the words on that one. It's if the name adds value, have a name, but if it's a single arity, then consider using just T.
Okay.
So if we think T key is useful, sure. And if we think it's obvious that it's just a T, then just a T.
I mean, I'm undecided. I mean, to me, it's not obvious that a rate limiter is generic over a key. I mean, for dictionary, it makes sense, but for rate limiter, I think like, unless you're already deep in the domain, it's not obvious that they're generic over
So the parameter does say partition key, so that makes it a little more obvious.
This is just for the partition create methods and the partition type of should they be T
They're all
T
named, yeah.
key or T partition key. And I think any of the names are fine.
Okay.
Whatever feels good on the day you write it.
Just make sure it starts with T.
Yeah.
All right, then be done then.
Thank you.
Sweet. So that took way longer than I thought it would have. So I guess now we can decide to either go with where am I coming? We can either go with we can either try with the tar archives, or we can try to finish this. What would you prefer, Carlos?
We can try the tar ones. Fortunately, Jeremy has some contacts already, so might make it easier.
It's great. Ship it.
So here I would like to propose a set of APIs that would offer support for reading, manipulating, and writing tar files. I'll start by giving a brief summary of tar. Tar is an archiving format. It's old, dating back to 1979, but it's quite robust. It started in the Unix world and is still very popular there. The purpose of this format is to allow packaging file objects together into a single file by storing them in a series of contiguous fixed-size blocks. And each file is preceded by a well-defined header which contains metadata describing the file. tar is not a compression format, but it is common to pair it with compression methods. The way this is done is by passing the final tar output archive to a popular compression algorithm like gzip or bzip, which will generate the compressed file that can be saved with an extension like targc, tarbc, etc. The tar format does not specify a central directory record like in zip, meaning that if you want to learn how many files are contained in a tar archive, you need to traverse the whole archive. The tar format evolved over time to be able to support additional requirements from the file system, mainly file name length. There are 4 well-known formats that we would be able to support, especially since the GNU tar tool supports generating files in all these formats. So the first format that we would support is V7. Sorry, I pressed space accidentally. The first format we would like to support is V7, is a basic format developed in 1979 by AT&T. The main restriction is that file name lengths are limited to 100 bytes and does not support FIFO, block device, or character device entries. But again, it's supported by the tar tool. And also it contains all the basic fields that are shared by all the other formats I'm about to talk about. The next one is Ustar. It's a POSIX format. It stands for Unix Standard Format. It allowed extending the file names a bit more, extra 155 bytes, and it offers support for FIFO, block device, and character devices. The next format, and the most popular, is the Pax format developed in 2001. It's also POSIX. It inherits everything from Ustar. It's the most flexible one because it prepends a metadata header before every actual file entry, in which the user can include any extender information about the file, including the actual file name of any length. The GNU tar tool documentation states that this is going to be, or maybe it already is, the default format for the tool. And finally, the fourth format is the GNU format. It's a variant of Ustar and inherits the same fields, but it was made internally incompatible with POSIX due to overlapping of the positions of some of the fields. It does not allow unlimited metadata like Pax, but it does allow longer file name lengths, and it also offers support to some rare file types. So now I would like to talk about the proposed APIs, but before I continue, someone is raising the question. Yeah.
No, I'm showing the fidget cube that I'm playing with.
That's not a question. So I can continue then. So the APIs that I'm proposing are divided into two groups. First, the Streamless Apis of quick use for the most popular use cases. With these APIs, which are in the tar file static class, the user can create an archive from the contents of a directory or can extract the contents of an archive into a directory. There's no need to interact with any details of the tar format or the individual entries. And then there's the other set of APIs that are meant for granular use, and they are divided in two classes. The first class is the tar reader class, which uses streams, and it allows iterating through the contents of an archive of any of the aforementioned formats, and inspects the metadata of individual entries. And it also allows extracting them to the file system individually. Then the other class is for writing archives. It also uses streams, and the user can create archives of any of the mentioned formats and modify the metadata as desired for the individual entries. Originally, the design was heavily inspired by zip archive, but it quickly became clear that combining the purposes, and I mean reading and writing, made the APIs difficult to use. Also, the concept of updating a tar archive would have been extremely difficult to implement, mainly due to the absence of a central directory to allow them to know the position of the entries in advance. But the update scenario can easily be replaced by combining the reader and the writer. And I guess we can jump to explain the individual APIs, and we can start with tar file. As you can see, we have create from directory, the sync and async variant.
One question I have is like to understand the format. So is the idea that basically is the entire tar file in one format, or is it that there is a container and then each entry also has different formats?
No, the idea is that the whole archive has all the entries written in one single format. I didn't find any mention in the specs about combining formats, so I don't think that's something that should be supported.
I think that's different in zip, right? Because in zip, I think each entry can have a different compression form. And there's a container format all up, but then the entries themselves can have different.
Right, but in zip, you can compress the contents of an entry with whatever compression format you desire. But the way the entries of the zip file are structured, they are all in the same compatible format.
Gotcha. And then I think in tar is just a container format, right? And then compression is usually layout on top, so you compress the entire thing rather than each individual entry.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
So the output of these the APIs, they could be passed to a gzip stream, for example, and with that we can generate the file, the tar gc file. So going back to tar file, we have create from directory and extract to directory. They are very similar to the zip ones. The difference is, well, we have the async version as well. The input is a source directory name and the destination archive file name for create from directory. And optionally, we can include the base directory as well, meaning that if this is true, the name of each entry will be prefixed by the folder name as an additional segment at the beginning. Any questions about these APIs?
So presumably our gzip will be relatively common, right? Would we have, would we just handle that transparently in here, or would you say we would have a gz tar file type that would handle the decompression?
Not yet, and the reason for that is because we have another issue open. Actually, you opened it, Imo, and we are trying to consolidate in a single enum all the compression formats that we have, and once we have that enum, we can modify all the compression formats that we have, and it would also benefit tar in a way that we can pass that enum as an extra argument to a new API that would allow us to output tar files that are also compressed in the specified compression format. I hope that was clear enough. So that's one reason why I didn't add any compression mention here, and also because we didn't want to take a dependency on system-wide compression yet, because one of the requests that we had was that we want this as an OOP package. And I think that would be problematic if we had a dependency on compression. But anyway, the main reason was the other one, that we still haven't decided how to consolidate all the compression formats in easy ways that would benefit all the archiving and compression format new APIs.
Would it overly complicate things if these methods gained an overload that took us? It may be, I guess we'd have to have it be a factory of how to create the compression or decompression stream. Like, because if you built it with the reader or writer manually, you would say the writer is going to output into a gzip stream that's in create mode, and then that would be then going out to a file stream and whatever. So instead of a destination archive file name, I guess the problem is coming up with what the overload looks like. So maybe it's a thing to think about for an add-on to the proposal, is these could be grown with, you provide the stream to output to, of go take this directory and go write it to the stream as a tar. And
yeah,
I would say like the primary point of this tar file type, like if you look at it, what we did in compression, is that this is basically a one. I think as soon as you have an overload that takes like a factory or something, like you're almost going down the path of like, you know, just instantiate the read. I think that's why I was asking, like, how common do we think like things like gzip tar files are, for example? Because if they're reasonably common, I think I would want a method that is like, you know, just look at the extension and do the right thing kind of. You know, if there's a standard that say like, you know, if it's gz.tar or tar.gz or what, and you know, we just automatically do it, rather than pushing all that policy on the call side, because at that point it's like, yeah, you just iterate yourself and feel this right.
Yeah,
because that's the whole point of this one, you know, single file.
It does come back to the question of layering, of should this be a peer with compression or should it be built on top of compression? Because
right.
the from a spec perspective, tar is an independent file format, and compressing it before or after is a thing that a tool can do. So it's tar and compression are peers, and a tool can unify them. But
so let's ignore the OOP for a second. So let's just talk about what we do in the platform. So presumably, like, where would this stuff go in .NET?
You mean the namespace?
No, like literally implementation. Do we put it in the same assembly where compression is? Do we do it in a net new assembly? Do we put other existing? How would that?
Well, I was thinking of adding it to its own assembly. I mean, we could also add it to compression, even if it, as Jeremy said, it doesn't make that much sense.
Yeah, I mean,
but I think it would be easier to just have it as a separate assembly, especially since we need it to be OOP.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's why I was saying, like, let's ignore the OOP for a moment, because I think if we just look at what we do in the platform layer, I think that informs us what we think the right layering is, right? So if we say this is a standalone DLL and we could depend on compression, or it could literally live inside of compression, then I think the argument to not depend on compression isn't as strong as if you say like, oh, this thing has to live in qual, for example, and compression isn't lib. So usually, like, I would say let's get the platform design right, and then once we have a handle on what that is, then let's talk about the OOP design. And I think you're right, from the OOP standpoint, you would need a net new assembly, probably, because that's the only thing that makes sense. Or we could add it to an existing OOP assembly if that would make sense. I think I could be wrong, but I think compression already has an OOP, so we might be able to put it there, for example.
But you mean zip file and broadly?
Yeah. I might be wrong, but I think that, so. That's what I'm saying. Like, to me, I would almost say the layering is like something we should look at the perspective of the platform itself. So like, if we just look at .NET 7, what do we think the right layering is? and then let's look at the constraints that the oops give us, and then I think then it will answer the question: can tar file depend on compression or can it not? And if the answer is it can, then I think it would make the APIs more usable. But that's how I would kind of approach that. I would not approach it from a spec point. I wouldn't say, oh, tar is independent of compression, because we know people use it very often combined, right? That's why, from a usability standpoint, it would make sense to me to say, hey, if tar gzip files are super common and you have a one-line method to extract them, then you have that. But again, like, it's reasonable to say, hey, we don't do it in tar file, we do it in gz tar file, separate type that sits on top of both of them, and that can depend on both. Also possible.
Well, the APIs that you mentioned that would generate a tar.gz file, I think it would make sense to add them to some type in system.io compression, and that would mean that we could keep system format tar separate.
Yeah, I mean, so that's what I'm saying. Like, I would literally say, like, imagine you just build .NET 7 for a moment, and then you think about what the ideal layering there is. If you say compression can depend on tar, but tar shouldn't depend on compression, well, then that gives you a design. Then I think once we have that, then I would take that design and say, okay, how can we oop this in a reasonable fashion? And I think for the oop, it would be fine to say, yeah, basically, like, okay, we can say, okay, for the oop, we don't have that convenience method, because it's it's just write this yourself. I'm just not a fan of saying, because of some naming or spec thing, we can't give you usable APIs, right? That's kind of the what I would consider the fake layering discussion sometimes, and we say, oh, we are within the same assembly, but we don't want one type dependent on it. That to me doesn't make sense from using. Like, if there are hard limitations on things need to be at different assemblies layers, yeah, that makes sense. Right? I would generally say, like, once things are in the same assembly, then I focus on have usable. But it also depends on how common it is, right? So, for example, if you tell me that, oh, the only compression people ever use with tar is gzip, and that might make it different from saying, oh, people use arbitrary compression files all the time, and then we wanted some sort of overload that takes a complicated enum. Oh, it's only ever gz files, then, well, maybe we should just handle that transfer.
Okay. In the chat, Joe is saying that there are no existing OOP assemblies for system.io compression. Zip file and broadly are in the shared framework. So I am not sure what the answer for this would be. I'd say, can we continue discussing the rest of the APIs and skip this to the end? All right.
It's also notably not just gzip. It's commonly also bzip and xz and lzip and a few others that get used. Gzip is just one of the most common.
Yeah, and the only one we have here, C standard would be the next one we would want to look into, which we also don't have it, but and bzip, I don't know if we would like to add it to our compression, but there are external packages that offer it. So if they offer streams, they could play well with this.
I mean, one of the things when I was working with Carlos on this before is making sure that, at least for the low-level APIs, that you're not limited to things that we have in the box for compression algorithms. It's you can glue whatever you want, since that's how it works with Unix input and output redirection anyway.
Right. And you might be able to just also have convenience method to just take. It would be relatively grab one of them.
Right, like, again, so tar file create from directory, source directory name, stream destination.
Exactly.
Would just be like, I'm gonna go assume that I have full control of this stream and just go write a bunch of stuff to it. And so I think that would be a reasonable overload at this layer, whether or not it is shared with compression. But we can...
Yeah, so I posted in chat something that I think would be an easy way to get this behavior while having a minimal API surface. Something that is not tied specifically to gzip, but we can talk about that later so as not to distract.
Yep. Okay, I see it. Yeah, the output of this API goes into gzip. Okay. All right, let's see. The rest of the APIs are for the detail of each entry. So there are different types of entries. There's a question in the chat asking why are they based the enums based on byte, sorry, and that's because they're literally represented by bytes in the header, and they can be any ASCII character. But the ones that are officially mentioned and supported and well defined are the ones that I'm listing here. Old regular file is a null character. Is used exclusively by V7. Then regular file, which is the version used by all the other formats, hard link, symbolic link, character device, block device, directory, and FIFO are supported at least by Ustar. Then global extended attributes and extended attributes. These are metadata entries. They are not supposed to be exposed to the user, but they are being mentioned here just for clarity. Internally, they are going to be used. The user will not have to interact with them. I'll explain with the examples later. And then the entry types that are supported by GNU are contiguous file, directory list, long link, long path, multi-volume, renamed or sim-linked, sparse file, and tape volume. Of these entries, contiguous file is, according to spec, treated as a regular file. It's a very rare type of file that is only going to behave differently in real-time operating systems. There's no mention what the name of the operating system is, and no mention in the spec of how differently they behave. So internally, we're just treating them as regular files. Directory list is just a directory which happens to have a data section, and the data section has the list of entries inside the directory. I haven't yet found a way to generate one with the new tar tool, but it should be able to behave as expected by these APIs. Long link and long path are metadata entries, just like extended attributes and global extended attributes, but they only contain a long link, literally, or a long path if they don't fit in the 100 bytes offered by the original header. And then multi-volume, rename, sparse, and tape, they are rare entry types for which I decided not to add support yet until it's asked, because they're very they are edge cases. So for now, they are not important. Then we have an enum describing the format with the default being unknown. If you can scroll a bit more. We already talked about that. And then we have the reader and the writer. The reader takes a stream in the constructor, and it should be able to detect the format automatically. If the format is Pax, then it will expose, if available, a global extended attributes, a read-only dictionary. And then the user is going to be able to retrieve the entries in a forward-only fashion with get next entry or the async version. The get next entry.
Why would that not just be empty?
What? What would not be empty?
So you said like if the format happens to be Pax, then you get the global extended attributes. Otherwise, it's null. Like, why wouldn't we just give you an empty dictionary instead?
It's an option.
I mean, it seems in those cases, it's like if you really cared, are there no attributes conceptually, or are there just, or
so
are they empty?
Maybe I should explain what the global extended attributes mean. in the Pax format, you can have an initial entry with containing metadata that applies to all the rest of the entries of the archive. It's optional. It doesn't always exist. But if it exists, then it would be accessed by the user via this property. I thought, well, it should be null because what if the format is not Pax? Then if it's empty, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I guess
become
my
empty.
point is just that things that are collections is usually weird when they're empty. Like it seems usually easier to just say if the things are absent, it's just an empty collection. Like
I mean, it's weird if they are null and they should be empty.
Yeah, because I mean, like to me, like it seems the code that I would write is the same, right? I would just say, well, if it's not null and the attribute is present, then do something. Well, you just remove the null check, and just becomes like, oh, is the thing present? If so, what's its value? Right? You just have one more code case that you don't care about. If you really wanted to care, or do I have attributes? You can still look at the format and say, well, was the format Pax or unknown or something else, right? It just like generally with collections that are null, it's people don't write code. I mean, now we have nullable annotation, so they will know about it, but like I still think it's just odd. For something that can be empty, I would probably prefer empty.
Yeah, Jeremy reminded me of something. With the tar reader constructor would have to read an initial entry to find out if there are global extended attributes. I think with what I currently have, it's possible to do it. And in that case, then after calling the constructor, you could call this property and get the global extended attributes. But if it's not possible, then it would have to be empty or null. I don't mind if it's empty or null for any format. I just thought null would be more proper for whenever the format is not Pax. Maybe empty could make sense if the format is Pax, and non-empty if we find a global extended attributes entry.
So I guess if I understand you correctly, you said like if you construct a reader over Pax, but you haven't read any entries yet, then you wouldn't have global extended attributes yet. I think if that's the case, then I think it would make sense to me to say like, well, before you call get next entry, it's null because I don't know yet what the attributes are, which is distinctively different from I have read them and they're empty or there can't be any, right? So I think in that case, being nullable makes sense because it's like, well, you don't know yet. You have to call get next first. But then if it's always at the beginning, it might also be reasonable to say, well, if you construct it with a particular format, we do it for you to avoid the null state, right? But yeah, I think it depends on implementation. But I think generally speaking, if something can't be there or it's always there but it's empty, it's more or less the same state.
Yeah, I mean, the question Levi asked in chat is the constructor that takes a stream doing work? Because if it's doing work, constructors have to be synchronous, and then Fowler will join the meeting and yell at everyone.
Yeah, that's true.
And then, so if by the time the constructor finishes, it's supposed to know what format it is, and if there were global extended attributes, assuming it was a Pax file, then we would need to make a open async in order to allow it to describe the notion of being called and then doing a read async in order until the point that it can determine that information. But
yeah, now I recall that discussion. Yeah, the constructor cannot retrieve the first entry because it has to be synchronous.
Then I think
so. I guess it should stay null.
Yeah, I mean, if the semantics are you have to traverse the first entry before global extended attributes can return you a value, I think then null makes sense because it's basically a temporary state until you have read the data. I think that would be
so Emo, in the case of a non-Pax tar or a Pax tar that did not have global extended attributes, would you move it to the empty dictionary then, or leave it as null because it did not apply to this file?
I would probably set it to an empty dictionary and just use null as the indicator. You have to read more entries.
Okay.
So get next entry. There's an argument there called copy data. And this is meant to help whenever the stream is non-sequable, like when the data comes from the network, and we need the data of the file to be copied into an internal memory stream, so that the user doesn't have to, so the user doesn't have problems reading the data later if all the entries are collected, for example. If they set it to false, then the requirement will be that if they have an unseekable stream, then they will have to process whatever data they have to process with the entry data and make sure that copy it somewhere else, because it's going to they are not going to be able to visit it at a later time.
So
I hope that was clear enough.
I think so. So basically, the entry that you return from the tar reader, presumably the data stream on it would pretty much, like if you say copy data false, data stream would presumably point effectively to the same stream you pass to the constructor. And then once you then call get next entry, well, then that data stream has advanced. So basically, if you try to read the entry after that, you're screwed, basically.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to point exactly where the data begins if you set false, and the user needs to make sure to immediately after read that data, save it somewhere else, or process it, whatever they want, because the pointer is not going to go back.
And if you say copy data, you basically, create a memory stream, copy the data in there, and then the data stream property on tar entry just points to that memory stream, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's a bit odd, but I think given that the format is effectively like, yeah, unless you read it, it's gone.
It's also solving a problem that we have in SIP. We don't really do this, and there are issues open related to unseekable streams where people complain that they run out of memory because we're copying everything.
I mean,
we didn't want to fall into this problem.
I don't think I would have a data stream property on tar entry. I think I would have the same as zip, where you basically have an open method that gives you back a stream, and then I would make that fail unless. So I would make that fail unless it's the first entry. If you read another entry, now it should throw an exception and say you can no longer read me because you advanced, basically, right? And then I think that would make it more clear what's happening.
Right. Initially, it was an open method instead of a data stream. Can you scroll back down a little bit, Jeremy? Oh, it's already there. Tar entry. The third property is data stream. Yeah. That's what we opted for instead of open, because what happens if the user wants to update the data and create a new archive? So let's say you retrieve the entries from with a reader from an existing archive. You only want to update one entry and write it to a new archive. Again, update doesn't exist, but this is the workaround. Then you edit the stream. You can basically substitute this data stream with a new one that contains the new data. And then you write all the entries. Then you write this one with the new data, then the rest of the entries. And there you go. That's your update.
I see.
We would also make sure to internally dispose the stream, the old stream, when you override the data stream with a new one.
So let me understand this then. So when I call tar reader get next entry, I get back an entry that has the data stream set to something. Then I call get next entry again. Is the data stream now null?
Is the data stream for if you're saving the entry?
Yeah. So basically, let's say
if it's an unseekable stream, it's not going to be null. It's just not going to be usable. The reader, since it's disposable, it's going to dispose of that stream at the very end, but it's not going to be usable unless you copy the data. So does that answer your question?
Sort of. So basically, so let's say I call get next entry twice, right? So I get back a tar entry 1 and I get back tar entry 2. What is the data stream return on tar entry 1 if the stream is non-seekable? It will give me back a non-null instance that then will blow up because I disposed it, or the tar reader has disposed it.
it's not going to be disposed yet. The tar reader will take care of that in the dispose. Since it's disposable, when the dispose section is reached, but it's not going to be a usable stream because you didn't copy the data, and we cannot move back the pointer to the position where the data begins.
Yeah, I guess my
by the way,
question is, what's
internally,
my
we use a
question is,
grabber.
what's the error condition? So basically, you're saying it's not disposed, but if I try to read from tar entry 1's data stream, I will get an exception that tells me, sorry, the stream wasn't seekable, you didn't stash it, so you can't do that. It's not like I get now suddenly the error. Like, what would be bad if tar entry 1 now points to tar entry 2? That's that kind of what I'm trying to get at.
I think the exception that we throw is it comes from stream saying that the pointer was beyond the limits.
Yeah, what would be nicer if you would get a more actual error message than that.
Sure.
Yeah. But yes, I think that it's just that I think to your point, right? The problem with zip files is people are surprised when they read from a network stream and then they get weird errors. That would be an example of a weird error, right? Because I mean, a copy data seems expensive, so I'm probably not very likely to do that unless I'm instructed to do that. And so the question is, if I'm not doing that and the stream isn't seekable, what errors do I get when I later on try to access the tar entry? It would be nice to say to tell like, hey, sorry, the stream wasn't seekable. You didn't copy the data, so no, you can only access the most recent tar entry.
Yeah, it's a good point. I can make sure to throw something meaningful for the user instead of the default error message.
Yeah, so, at least when I was talking with Carlos, everything that we came up with seemed like you would do this in a loop, and most people would never look at an entry once they've called get next entry. So we left the default. Or we thought that it was best for the default to be just a view over the file, and that if you did need to do something complicated with save this for later, then that's when you get to either know you have a seekable stream or just say copy data true.
Yeah, I mean,
so
it makes sense.
It's the edge power case.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, I can expect people. I mean, people do weird stuff, right? But so it's just, what's the error message? And why is the data stream nullable? Like, when would it ever be null?
Not all entry types have a data stream, a data section. It's just regular files, and that special case of the contiguous file and the directory list. But everything else, like a directory or a block device or a FIFO, they don't have a data section. It's completely empty, so it would be null.
Gotcha. So it's literally a logical component of the data entry. When there's no data in the data, then
correct. Okay, maybe we covered everything from tar reader. Anything else, or I can skip to writer?
Yeah, so my question is, extract to file on the tar entry only makes sense when I'm reading, right?
Extract to file. That's a good question. Not necessarily. If you're writing, if you create your own instance of a tar entry, which I haven't reached because there are specific sealed classes that inherit from tar entry. If you fill it with data and you fill out all the properties, nothing is stopping you from extracting it to file anytime.
Yeah, I mean, right now we have I don't think we've added the API to easily create a file with a particular UID and GID, etc. But with this, if you create the entry that has that metadata set locally and call extract a file, then congratulations, you just found a way to set the GID.
So I guess it seems a bit odd to me that we have extract to file, but we don't have the inverse, right? Like basically populate the data stream from a file.
Good point. But
I thought we had that somewhere.
No, I think we discussed it. I don't remember why we decided not to opt for that, but we did add a method to the tag writer called add file, which you just point to the file, give it an entry name, and internally will take care of whatever you need to do without having to generate an entry from the file. I mean, I'm not opposed to having a method to generate a tar entry of a specific format.
I mean, it's also the question of
from an existing file.
If I call extract to file, what happens to the data stream? Presumably that after I call this method, data stream is now effectively done.
If it's
Yep.
Yes, that's correct.
So I guess then my question, generally speaking, is like, what value does this method give over the naive? I guess it sets the file modes and stuff as well.
Yeah, sets the mode bits, sets the UID, the GID. If it's a directory, it knows to call, well, extract a file. If it's a directory, probably doesn't make sense, but yeah, it does the like 80 lines of code that you need to do this, right?
Yeah, so not having that would be a bad idea.
Yeah.
Also, one thing to keep in mind is if you obtain a tar entry from the reader will dispose it for you. But if you create an instance manually with a tar entry constructor, then the data stream is going to be null by default, even for a regular file, which means you will have to provide a stream, and it's your responsibility to dispose it separately. That would make sure, because the tar entry is not disposable, as you can see. So giving the user the responsibility of creating the stream also gives them the responsibility of disposing it.
I see. So you're saying if we had public void add to file on tar entry, then yeah, we can do whatever we need to do to populate the entry, including setting the data stream, but then the user is on the hook to call dispose after.
For add file?
Yeah.
No, it would internally create the entry, populate all the fields,
that's what I'm
save
saying.
it to the stream,
and
then it will dispose it internally within the same method.
Yeah, because because you added the method to tar writer. I'm saying like if you had the method on tar entry, then the problem is that the user would have to dispose the data stream themselves.
Yeah, if we had like Pax tar entry dot from file system object and then the path, then if it was a file and you now have a data stream, then the GC will eat it at some point. But
that was the reason why we didn't.
That would be a very weird ownership model, or it would be an unclear ownership model.
Yeah, I think to me, I mean, you could probably get away with doing it from write entry, or at the very end when you dispose the tar writer itself, but it's just
that's the reason why we didn't add the method for creating an entry from a file. The lack of ownership from the data stream.
I guess, I mean, it's always going to be a challenge to make writers and readers symmetric because they just are fundamentally not always symmetric. But I mean, at least I would consider making the method maybe an overload to write entry quite as all. Like write entry from file for
we have
other than calling it add file async. It just seems odd.
Yeah, add file is just you're not going to get to interact with the file at all, and then you have below the write entry, which receives an entry that you constructed manually.
Yeah, but conceptually, the method is creating an entry and adding it to archive. Logically, right?
We can you repeat that?
So logically, when you call add file, the method internally creates an entry and writes it to the archive, right? So like that's what I'm saying. Like conceptually, it writes an entry. You don't have to pass it in. You just
okay. So
directly
are you proposing to change the name of add file to write entry from file?
Something like that, because I mean at least that ties them a bit more together, right? Right now it seems just they're.
Sure, I'm open to renaming.
And then I wasn't really thinking about it at the time, Carlos, but I think you also work on I/O. So is add file, or is it add file system object? Like if you call add file and give it a directory, will it create just the directory entry and create that, or is it going to throw if your target is not a
good
file?
Question. No, good question. We should be able to add directories without the content with this particular method.
So just the directory, FIFO block device. So this is really, add. I mean, we can call it write entry from file and then have in the docs. It's not limited to files if we think that the name being more complicated is too weird, but.
Yeah, because adding file system object is way too
write
long.
write entry from file system. I
you
don't know.
could call it from path, maybe. That's not great either, because you definitely read the contents if it's a file.
Yeah,
I think from file is
I think file covers everything except directory, but if you really embrace Unix, then directories are files. So, because you can open them with open, and it's just up to you to know what to do with that. So,
I mean, you could probably also just make them read loads of write entry. In taking a string path, and it's clearly that.
It's true.
So
just write entry, string path, string question mark entry name.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm a bit lost. Can you repeat that?
So you could just have, instead of having add file async, you could literally just name them write file and write file async and change file name to path.
Sorry, I thought you were saying write entry instead of write file.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Okay.
Oh, file name to path. Yeah.
So we have write entry that takes a tar entry and write entry that takes a string and a knowable string. Yeah. That seems fair.
Okay. Well, since we are in the tag writer now, you can see that there are a couple of constructors. The first one lets you pass as the last argument a key value pair of strings that represents the global extended attributes, which would signify that you want a Pax format. You are not allowed to select the format for this constructor. For the second constructor, you can select the format, but it doesn't let you pass a key value pair, so it means you don't want any.
When are you writing those?
When? Well, good question. Assuming it's not a problem, I'm currently writing them in the constructor, but maybe it should be a task deferred for when we write the next entry or in the dispose, depending if everything is written.
Yeah, probably delay it to the first call to write entry or dispose, whichever comes first.
No problem. Yeah, I can do that. Again, constructor needs to be synchronous.
Exactly. So like you want to basically don't do it. That would basically. I mean, at that point, because I mean, the other reason I'm asking is because it seems odd to take an I collection rather than an I global, for example. Because you presumably only iterated once.
Oh yeah. We discussed this, Jeremy and I, and let me know if I'm explaining it incorrectly, but we want the minimum possible abstraction used here. We don't want to pass a dictionary.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, it seems generally weird that on the reader side you expose it as an I read only dictionary, but then you basically require an I collection rather than, let's say, an I read only dictionary, which would be symmetric, or at least I read only collection, or just I enumerable. Right? You don't actually care about this being a dictionary, you just care about the key value pair. In which case, enumerable.
Yeah.
It's just that internally I have a dictionary.
Right, but I collection, you don't need the count. So I collection can be I enumerable, an enumerable of key value pair.
Yeah.
I enumerable of key value pair. Okay, yeah.
Dictionary has a constructor that takes those.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see, tag writer format.
And then the other question is like, why would you have leave open before the global?
No reason. I was hoping you would tell me what's the right thing to do here. I forget.
I mean, we should decide where we want to put it, right? If the general idea is we leave we put leave open at the end of all of the optional constructors, then I think it would be the other way around. In which case, I mean, in general speaking, like I think people probably like if people do packs, they're probably more likely to pass in attributes than they are into require the stream to leave. It's generally desirable to.
Okay, yeah. Leave open can be again.
I mean, if we were to add something to this in the future, then leave open would no longer be at the end because the way that we grow the overloads. But I don't really see that happening, so we can flip them now.
Yeah,
I think we got there by literally he had leave open first, and then we added another optional parameter, so we added it at the end.
Yeah.
It was pre-release evolution.
Right.
But we can clean it up for release.
Anything else to discuss from TargWriter? Maybe some other question will arise later, but we can continue with our entries.
So dispose will do IO, right? And so I presume I would think if you call dispose async, that's where the IO would happen and then dispose.
Correct. In the case of the TargWriter, the main difference with zip archive, for example, is that zip archive first collects all the entries and then iterates through all of them and then writes them in the dispose. Here, as soon as you call write entry or add file, it gets written into the stream. And once you dispose, we close the archive, and that's the way the spec says that we have to write 2 empty blocks after the last entry to signify that that's where the archive finished. So that's what we would do in the dispose. Only write those 2 blocks.
Right,
And possibly the
global
global
stream, right?
if they created a stupid archive.
What?
And possibly also write down the global attributes if they created a Pax archive with global attributes and no other entries.
Correct. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Which will be a fun test to write.
But the writer does own the streams, right? Unless you specify leave open. So if I call dispose, the stream is also disposed, right?
If
Correct.
leave
It
open
won't
was
get
false.
disposed.
Yeah.
We will write everything, but it won't get disposed if we leave it open for more additional use.
Makes sense.
Okay, maybe we can skip to the next, the tar entries. So if you can scroll down a bit.
We are already 20 minutes over. Like, I'm happy to go further, but
We can continue on another meeting, or we can continue right now. I don't know. We can make it democratically.
I think a thing worth. So I'll jump us ahead because I know what's going on. The thing that we probably want to talk about a little bit right now, in case it causes a rethink, is the model for tar entry. When Carlos and I were working together, is tar entry represents everything that's in the V7, aka base format, and so it's abstract with an internal constructor, so it's not extensible outside this library. And then every format exposes their own tar entry type, including V7, just for symmetry. So there's a hierarchy to this instead of trying to cram everything down into one flat structure. And so if there's objection to there being a hierarchy, then that may require a rethink. But I think it ended up being the most obvious model. And to jump ahead to the complicated question on it, TarWriter accepts the notion that you might give it an entry from the wrong format, and it will adapt it to the best of its ability for your destination. So if you're writing a V7, it'll throw away everything that's not in the base class. And if you're writing a Pax, it will try and convert from GNU into Pax, etc.
which I assume makes sense because people do want to copy archives into form, right? And the way would be you loop on archive and push the entries.
Right. So it is polymorphic, so that if you're doing the reader, you can see, hey, it's a POSIX archive. You're going to have to cast the things to tar entry POSIX to see what the POSIX extension. Sorry, that's actually a weird intermediate abstract class. It's Pax. You should cast the things to Pax to get the Pax specific data. But if you just are doing a copy and update, then just create your new one, read from the old one, call write entry until you get the one you want to change or the new one you want to append, and then you're good to go. But,
Are you scrolling the page? Because it might be frozen. Oh, okay. This is something I wanted to discuss. I had to add a abstract class in the middle called tar entry POSIX, which defines the fields or the properties from the header that are shared by everything that came after the first POSIX standard. So Ustar, POSIX, and even GNU, they all inherited this, even if GNU is not POSIX itself. The reason why I also added this intermediate abstract class is because it was becoming a bit difficult when writing the unit tests, because I had to special case every single class and then verify the device major, device minor, gname and uname values separately. But having this would help simplify detecting if I have one or the other. I'm hoping this is this makes sense. It was the last addition. Might not be desired to have two abstract classes inherit one from the other, but I wanted to discuss that here. If it's not something we want, then it can stay like it was before, which is everything inherits from tar entry.
yeah, I mean, the other two things in the hierarchy is V7 could go away and just be tar entry, and POSIX could go away and just be Ustar, and then Pax and GNU extend Ustar because that's what they logically did. But I think it probably looks better as calling them intermediates and saying like, no, you got a Ustar from Ustar instead of you need to understand the evolution of the format.
Okay.
That's just me, at least. So that's me saying I think that what you have here is fine.
Okay. Cool. Details about the constructors. Well, tar entry v7, it receives the entry type and the entry name. The user can modify the entry name later if they want. It was a restriction in zip archive entry. I didn't know why, but it's better to add it right now, and then if they want to change it, it's possible, especially if the entry comes from a reader and then they want to change it, write it into another writer, then
One question I have is like, why are there entry names for the one that takes the file, add file?
Figure it out. That it should figure it out based on the file name.
We didn't make it optional rather than passing in. Almost, it makes more sense to default and just.
Yeah, that won't create an ambiguity.
I'm lost. Can you point at where he's mentioning?
He's not on screen. He's back at add file.
So
okay.
He's trying to write the notes up so we can go to lunch.
That's a good point. Maybe.
Yeah, I think those can be defaulted.
I think that would be. Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because of like on the tar entry it's non-nullable, and so I kind of assumed that.
Right.
I'm still not entirely sure what that means though, because I mean presumably the path is fully qualified. So what, like, how do you know how to make it relative?
Go ahead. I can say that if you pass a null entry name, it could mean that you want to add the file to the root of the archive in the hierarchy of segments. At least that's how I understood it.
But that would be the only thing that makes sense, right? But
yeah, so it would just use the path.get file name version of it. So it's, if you want hierarchy if you want a directory structure represented in your entry, then you are responsible for controlling the entry name.
Right.
And if you just want to be like, go build a tar with these 4 files and like they all come from the same directory, their names aren't going to conflict, just use the local directory file name. Like, then whatever.
Right.
So it's possible that most usages will be specifying an entry name, but it also creates an easy thing for somebody who wants to create them, like just these 4 files, glue them together.
What else? There are a few varieties we could show in the screen from the constructors of the other tar entry types. Pax is the one that is the most different because it receives, once again, something that we can change, but it's a key value pair of strings representing the extended attributes for this entry. So as I mentioned in Pax, all the entries are preceded by another entry that contains all the metadata for that actual entry. If they want to add anything that is not part of the header, they can add it to the extended attributes. The tar writer should be smart enough to know, okay, if the second argument is an entry name that is very long, we are going to save it in the extended attributes internally. The user doesn't have to do that. But it's important that the user is able to pass the dictionary of extra metadata because, well, it's heavily used. And if it's passed, then it can be later read using that property below called extended attributes.
So the extended attributes you pass in null, I suppose that means you get back an empty dictionary.
Yeah, that could.
And that parameter should also change from collection to enumerable.
Yeah.
Okay, so does anybody have objection to the tar entry hierarchy?
No. I mean, it seems, I mean, you could munch it all together in one, but then.
Right, and I think we looked at that at one point, and it's everything that's past the base gets nullable, and it's weird to know when can you expect this and what things have the same nullarity grouping, and that's where the hierarchy came in.
Yes.
So I recommend, given that we're already half an hour over, that as long as we're okay with the notion of the hierarchy, we come back and talk about the details of the entries in a later meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, I liked I'm intrigued by the tar entry builder idea that was shared in the chat as well. Might be worth spending some time offline.
Maybe. Just the only thing, like, these are all get set, so you can set them and then you're done. Why did we need a builder? But yeah, we can talk about that later.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll continue later.
Ooh, I can answer the chat question. Bastion, no, it should not be an iDictionary so that it cannot be modified. If you want to modify it, you get to make a copy.
Yeah, so what?
You get to replace the entry.
So what happens when you modify it? Like, do you have a built-in notion of read-only?
I guess that's true. We should maybe then, actually discuss that next time, because if we are doing just the modify, since everything else was set, maybe we do want the tar entry packs to expose it as a writable dictionary. But
we can discuss that.
So good question, Bastion. I retract my answer.
So I will mark it as needs work, and I will flip it back just so that something has happened. Otherwise my tool doesn't pick it up.
Okay.
And then we flip it back to ready for reviews. So I think next week we should probably like at least book 90 minutes on this, maybe even the full actually.
I feel like there was a suggestion that next week is already reserved for generic math. So next week is 2 weeks from now. As far as tar is concerned. Yeah,
that might be. I mean, yeah, if you know, if it prevents progress, we can also book it somewhere. But I think we need some time to think about it anyways. But I mean, you know, I think we're pretty close. Right?
Yeah, we advanced a very big chunk today. I think that it's just the small details that we have to discuss next.
Sounds good. Alrighty, then have a nice lunch.
Thanks, you
Thanks.
too. Bye.